Chris Ives, so nice to see you. You're teaching at Stonehill College outside of Boston, and you've had a lot of years in Japan and been studying Zen Buddhism and other forms of Buddhism for a long time, and practicing Buddhism as well, contributing to the engaged Buddhist movement, one could say. So let's begin with just a sense of what is a Buddhist cosmology? What's this idea of interdependent co-arising?
Yeah, Buddhism, it does have certain creation myths, but by and large, the Buddhist worldview is that everything is interrelational, that you or I come to exist not because we have a soul that came in here in the 1950s, but rather what we are in any phenomenon, this watch, my hand, is the function of a whole vast array of inputs, more technically conditioning factors, all of the influences, not only matter, but also, certain experiences I might have had that shape me or shape you or shape anything. And so the idea is that relationship comes first, that everything is interrelational, in process, and that makes it possible to talk about you or me or this flower or this table. So it's a process of interrelational view of reality, and it's that interrelationship gives forth or gives birth to all of the different particular things in the world.
It's a very rich and compelling and inviting worldview in a way, isn't it? And how does this help us with a sensibility for nature, or ecological sensibilities? Can you draw us out on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of ecological sensibilities, that may be what Buddhism can bring to the environmentalist table. A whole series of practices, meditation, chanting, certain visualizations, that really try to help people realize that fundamentally I'm not a separate ego here with my walls, my interests, my fears, over and against the world around me, but rather I am in very intimate relationship. I'm affected by things around me, in turn I'm affecting them, and this is back and forth continually. And so in many ways I think it helps people overcome that sense of being a separate self. And then, as you know, Buddhism has various ways of addressing certain mental states like greed and ill will and ignorance that contribute to that sense of being a separate, disconnected person. And so a lot of what Buddhism is doing, in many ways, to transform people, or if you want to talk about salvation, is to help people break through that guarded sense of self that's backed up by our greed, our anger, and all of those things that bolster the ego and our self-righteousness or whatever, and help us break beyond that and realize that, no, I'm not some separate enduring soul, but I am very much, dancing with all of this, very much affected by that. And that's not only personally, or you might say spiritually liberating, but has vast ecological significance in terms of Buddhist meditation really helping people get the fact that we do live in a field of energy, an ecological web, this grand cosmic process of creativity and change. We're not some sort of separate little billiard ball on the table, but rather we're here, a kind of wave on the surface of a great ocean, some sort of manifestation of a vast energy field.
Yes, beautiful. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen Vietnamese monk, speaks of, when he comments on the Heart Sutra, this emptiness and form, and he says, if you see this page, you see a cloud, right?
Yeah,
and these images that you as Buddhist scholars and teachers are giving us of how deeply embedded we are marvelous.
Yeah, he uses the concept of interbeing, which is his translation of a term. There's a term in Sanskrit and Pali, these original languages of Buddhism. I often translate it as interrelational arising. And as you know, another major Buddhist doctrine is no soul. And that to a lot of people is quite scary, especially if you're brought up in a religious tradition that believes in the soul. And Thich Nhat Hanh, as you're saying, has a wonderful way of describing that. It doesn't mean that you don't exist or this is all an illusion, but if there is a Chris that we might identify as being a separate soul, it's really a function of all the non-Chris factors that bring me into being. So that piece of paper, it's a function of photosynthesis, sunlight, the nuclear fusion of the sun to send that light to the leaves with their chlorophyll to do different, chemical reactions to bring about, wood. And then there's a logger coming who has a chainsaw made, maybe in China, had oatmeal for breakfast, who's cutting down that tree and then getting it to the pulp mill to turn it into paper. So, that's where we say, if you really can look deeply at a piece of paper, along the lines of this Buddhist idea of interbeing or interrelational arising, you'll see the whole cosmos in that piece of paper. The inputs, the conditioning factors are that vast.
Right.
And again, it's what the logger had for breakfast, who grew that food, how it was grown, where it was grown, the soil. I mean, all of that is pulled into that piece of paper that we might think of as just a thing or a separate entity that we call piece of paper.
Right.
And it's much more marvelous than that.
Yes, and I hear he does this exercise of eating a tangerine where you actually feel and experience and so on. So these are some of the things, as you say, Buddhism can offer us, the consciousness of this interdependence, metaphors, and then practices and so on. You spent a lot of time in Japan and studying Zen Buddhism, and can you give us a feeling for views of nature out of a Zen Buddhist context?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at the history of Buddhism and Buddhist views of nature, originally about 2,500 years ago when the religion began in North India, a lot of early Buddhists were actually somewhat nervous about nature. Nature was identified as the realm of samsara, of rebirth and re-death, that the material world was something that triggered our desires, led to attachment. And so there was originally a kind of world-denying aspect of Buddhism. As Buddhism gets to East Asia, in part through the Taoist influence and other influences, you start getting more of a positive appreciation of nature. And this is where you get Taoism, and then in Japan, Shintoism, with a belief there are spirits in natural phenomena that are awe-inspiring, coloring Buddhism and bringing about a more positive evaluation of nature. And then you get the aesthetic tradition, for example, of Japan, where nature is often seen as not only beautiful, but in some ways teaching us things, teaching us about impermanence, the cherry blossoms that bloom in spring and yet are gone a week later. And so you get this appreciation of nature as exemplifying Buddhist doctrines like this notion of interrelational arising. And you get the Zen tradition in particular talking about aesthetic appreciation of nature as a way to open up to the world around you rather than being caught up in all your day-to-day petty concerns, and to really appreciate, in a sense, the magic of all of this emerging, rising, and falling before you. That being said, at times in Japan, the appreciation of nature is in some case a kind of tamed, miniaturized, stylized nature, like a little bonsai tree, or the one flower that's there in a little receptacle for the tea ceremony. There's some interesting things around Japanese culture and some of the trepidation around wild nature in all of its power and all of its, in a sense, creative chaos and all of its fertility. Maybe that's beyond our discussion for today, but there's some reasons why that kind of wild nature at times is, a little intimidating to certain Japanese, and not quite as appreciated as, again, that flower in the flower arrangement, or the bonsai in the little vase or whatever.
So there is this huge aesthetic sensibility in Japan, as you've just said, in the sense of the seasons and watching the cherry blossoms from north to south and celebrating them, and then bringing gifts for the season, the foods of the season, eating just the right kinds of vegetables and so on in the seasons. And as well, there's, in many of the poems of Japan, there's a symbolic consciousness, isn't there, of how we weave ourselves, Saicho and moon and enlightenment. Can you say a little bit about the poetry?
Yeah, in a lot of poems, you're mentioning, seasonal imagery. In a lot of Japanese haiku poems, the traditional 17-syllable short form, there's often what's called a kigo, which is a seasonal word. A lot of haiku will have some reference to, cherry blossoms or red autumn maple leaves, flagging the season. And in many cases, what you have there is nature, in many ways, being, again, as I mentioned, a kind of teacher. It's giving us lessons in impermanence, or it's indicating what enlightenment might be. The moon is often seen as a symbol of wholeness or enlightenment. In some cases, not only cherry blossoms, but the morning glory, the plant that grows up on its vine and opens up in the morning and then basically droops and dies by evening. That too is seen as nature giving us an example of impermanence. There are other imagery, other symbols in nature as well. The pine tree representing longevity, the bamboo shoot representing youthful vitality. But the Japanese sea in a sense, nature encoded with a lot of values, a lot of teachings, a lot of things to keep in mind in terms of especially impermanence.
Right. So the movement of Zen has clearly come to North America and Europe, and people like Gary Snyder have picked it up hugely, living in Japan for 12 years, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. But now there's Zen monasteries and temples and centers and so on for practice, but also are they doing ecological work? Is this part of their concerns?
Yeah, one of the main examples is the Green Gulch Zen Center there in Marin County, north of San Francisco over the Golden Gate Bridge. And in that valley leading right down to Muir Beach there on the Pacific Ocean, there's been a long tradition for, at this point, 40 years of people working with that environment, trying to do organic gardening, thinking about what are indigenous plants, what's sustainable agriculture, a kind of stewardship of the land, and that being very much woven into Zen practice. If you think about certain Buddhist values, such as mindfulness or attentiveness, basically trying to cultivate those mental states that are religiously or spiritually important in the act of gardening, in the act of being attuned to, when migratory birds like swallows come through, when certain weeds are blooming, etc. So it's a very interesting way of sort of including traditional Buddhist values, traditional Zen practice in an organic gardening farm. And there are other centers I can mention. They're doing similar things, in some cases special rituals, commemorating animals that may have been killed by people, different rituals, blessing trees. And yes, Gary Snyder, going back into the 1950s, has been a major role model thinker with his eco-poetics, influencing how people are sort of wedding environmental concern with Zen practices and institutions such as monastic communities in very creative ways.
Right. The other person maybe we can conclude with is, of course, Joanna Macy and her Buddhist work, and maybe you want to share a little bit about what she's been doing.
Well, she's remarkable because I think a lot of us, when we think about Buddhism and ecology, we're thinking about the things I've been talking about, how to have a deeper sense of being part of nature rather than a part of nature, separate from nature, living simply, living mindfully, kind of a low impact lifestyle. And what she really gets at, among other things, is looking at nuclear waste as arguably, maybe second only to climate crisis. We can talk about that in another time, but looking at the vast amounts of nuclear waste and what do we do with that? Do we try to bury it in the ground in places like Yucca Mountain in the Southwest? And she started a whole project called Nuclear Guardianship. And again, tying this into Buddhist principles of mindfulness, paying of attention, thinking about long expanses of time, which of course is very relevant to nuclear waste with a half-life of, in some cases, 25,000 years or longer, or 250,000 years depending. And so she's doing some really interesting, in that sense, environmental work in terms of keeping our eye on the ball in terms of the dangers of nuclear power and the whole issue of, what do we do with the waste? Do we just try to keep it out of sight and then have it leak out of the barrels that people are trying to store it in? Or, as she suggested, maybe we should have some kind of pagodas in the center of towns where we put the nuclear waste right there, and we are the guardians. We're aware of it, we take responsibility for it, we guard it, and we make sure that it doesn't leak or it doesn't somehow affect human health or the health of the bioregion.
Right. Well, Chris, you've given us a wonderful overview of this tremendous, penetrating interbeing that Buddhism offers us now, and as well these practices and the mindfulness that you keep returning to, and this sense, I think, of wisdom, discernment, and compassion that you've spoken of so often. And I thank you for the work you're doing to bring these ideas into our modern world with such energy and insight.
Well, thank you for the hugely important work you're doing. It's immense, so thank you.
Thank you, Chris.